All right, guys, so we're going to talk about note-taking strategies. This should be a fairly short lecture. There's a ton of examples in your book, so you really want to get through those as well. What's important about note-taking strategies is that you have a couple, and the reason why is so that you might have different note-taking strategies for different classes. So ones that you might need for a sociology or humanity class might be something completely different than you need for a science or a math course. So it's important to have these different strategies. It's not likely you're going to have one that works for everything. So why do we take notes? It supports the listening. We talked about this in our active listening lecture. It's how you respond. It helps keep you focused in class. And then it helps you figure out areas that you might need more information or places you have questions. Again, so it allows you to test your understanding of the material. It helps with the remembering. So going back to our memory lecture, this is that way that we move that information from our sensory into our working memory. This is the way that we focus and pay attention to it so that we can encode it. Gives you a sense of what the instructor thinks is important. So again, you're not going to write everything that your instructor says. You're going to look for those keywords, key concepts, and pay attention to those verbal and nonverbal cues as you're listening. And then this creates your ultimate study guide. So by the time you have your exam, you should have what we call a master set of notes. And these are notes from your text and from the lectures that you've been able to put together and combine and use as a study guide. So of course, it helps to be organized. I've definitely had some students hurt my heart when they've opened up their backpack and like just a puff of papers shoots out. Please don't waste your study time looking for your notes. You should have a somewhat organized system so that you know where they are. Of course, use your own paper so that you can flip to different pages. So that you can go back and reference that material, especially if you have a class that's going to be super, super heavy on the note taking, then you want to be able to go back and find that information. We talked about using visual cues. I like to color code things. I know that's not for everybody, but any ways that you can highlight, underline, draw, if that's your style, any way to help you go back and mark that information that you know that it's maybe more important. We talked about chunking and memory and how that helps with our memory. So when you're making your ultimate study guide, you won't necessarily have all the time to do this in class to chunk the information, but when you're putting it together, you want to put that information together in groups that make sense to you and make sense for the class. And then, of course, write clearly as possible. What I recommend, I think most of us are savvy enough in this world of text messages and the little abbreviations we use to type out messages, or not type out, I guess. Use things like that. Just make sure it's something that you'll understand and that you'll remember when you go back to it. There's different types of note-taking systems. I will tell you, there is not a right way to take notes. What that means is take notes the way that works for you. If it's not working for you, then experiment with different types. But use the one that don't force yourself to do Cornell notes if you're never going to go back and fill in the paraphrase at the bottom or write out the side. Cornell notes is one that you kind of have to prep before going into class. If you're never going to do it, don't try to prep for it while taking notes while in the class and stress yourself out. Find a different note-taking system if that's what's going to work for you. But have these different ones. If your note-taking system is failing, maybe you do need Cornell notes. Cornell notes are really great for classes that have like a lot of new information. And then the best part with Cornell notes is this summary at the bottom. If you remember from our Bloom taxonomy and from our memory, when we paraphrase, when we put things in our own words, that's really helps with engaging in that information, figuring out your knowledge gaps. And so Cornell Notes is one of the few that I really like for that. It doesn't mean you have to use it. Doesn't mean it's the right one, but it is one when you have a really heavy note-taking class that has a lot of new information. It is a good one to use. Some people, when you look at your learning preferences, if you like the visual, some people draw out their notes and they might use the concept maps, and that's great too, or timelines. Find out the ones that work for you. Play with these different ones in different classes so that you can go back and figure out which one plays into your strengths and your learning preferences. Here's some more examples. So here's a mind map and a timeline. Again, these are really good if you're a really visual person. This is really helpful for history. I know I'm terrible with dates when it comes to history. I can tell you key concepts, but don't ask me when it happened. So this might be a good way to help you memorize just those dates. If you're lucky enough to get maybe the PowerPoint from the professor ahead of time, this is a great way to take notes and follow along with the PowerPoints. You can print it out in this outline method or note-taking method. Depending on if you're using Google Slides or PowerPoint, there's different ways to do it. So you can Google how to do that if you're not sure, but then you can print it out like this. And then write along, or this is another one to sort of kind of like the mind map to put it all together for you in a diagram. So general tips, you do have to be prepared. You do have to bring a minimum, paper and a pen or pencil. Label, date, whatever works to help you find those notes. I'm not going to tell you the one way to organize notes because we're all a little bit different. At a minimum, a date might be helpful. So you can go back and put them in the order that you took them. Maybe you just label them by the concept from that class or the week of that class, whatever is going to make sense for you. Definitely leave space. This will allow you to go back and fill in or add to your notes if you need to. If your class allows you to use a laptop, you can do that, but make sure that you can still see. Make sure that you're not, you've got all the other browsers closed. And that, again, you're not typing everything that the professor says, you're not dictating, you're just reporting those key concepts. And follow the next point. Don't try to capture everything that is said. Definitely pay attention and probably copy anything the professor writes on the board. That's usually, we only do that when that's important. We talked about signals and abbreviations. Just make sure that they make sense to you so that when you're going back to your notes a week later, you're like, I have no idea what this acronym is. Make sure you're using stuff that you know. Identify a method for your own thoughts and questions and keep them separate from the instructor set. So if you're writing notes and you have questions, write them to the side. Just make sure that you're clear when you're writing it, that is your question. So that you can go back and either ask the professor later, or you can go research on your own, look at the textbook. It's really about making it clear so that when you're, again, if it's a week before you look at your notes, you don't want to confuse yourself. Is that my question? Was that an instructor's question that I need to know? Just things like that. However you want to label it so that you remember why you had that question. Maybe create a symbol if you get lost behind so that you know to go back. We always want you to review your notes as soon as possible after class. If you remember from our forgetting curve, how quickly we lose information. So if you have time that day, go back and review them, but review them again before the next class. That will help with that memory and that repetition and help you be more prepared for class. And then writing that summary. So again, that's a big piece of Cornell notes, but even if you're not using Cornell, anything that you can do to write it out, maybe teach it to yourself, that really helps you engage in that information, and it really helps you find areas that you're weak in, that you thought you understood a concept until you tried to explain it. Because I know for me, that always happens to me on the test. I get that question and I think I know it until I try to write out the answer. This is a way to practice that before the exam. All right, and the biggest part to note-taking is organize, which I know some of us are stronger than others with that. So pick one that works for you. Don't try to use a super duper organized system if you're just going to not use it. Find the one that works for you. Preferably, if you can, print out your notes. They're great to have on the computer, but there is something about handwriting notes and writing things out that just helps with our memory. If you use note cards, if you have plastic holders, just keep them somewhere where you can keep them safe, right, and keep them clean. Group your notes. That's that chunking that we talked about so that it's all together. Spend that time, part of your study, part of your prep, part of the hours that you are putting on your planner or your calendar each week dedicated to school is spending that time putting that information together. It all goes back to that moving it from the working memory to long-term, how you're encoding it, putting it all together and making it all make sense. So it's easy for you to go back and reread and to scan and to use as a study guide. If you have an exam and you get it back and you're able to keep it, some classes do this, some don't. Make sure you have the correct answers and then put it with your notes, especially if you have a class as a cumulative final, meaning you're doing a final or maybe a midterm over that whole section. Just because you're not taking that exact test again, you're probably going to see that information again. So you can use that as your study guide. And then review, review, review. That's why you want to put space in your notes so you can go back and in your summary and you can add notes, you can add thoughts, you can add questions that maybe you need to find the answer to. Your notes are your ultimate study guide, and you can get them again from reading, from lectures. If you use any outside materials, whether it's YouTube, whether you visit with a tutor, put all those notes together, and that's going to be a really easy way for you to go back and study by test time. All right, guys, thanks so much. That's the end of our lecture for note taking.